Nurses. What was your scariest moment on the job? I was reading to my patient Rose when she got the call that they'd found her a heart. She started crying because her son Raymond had power of attorney, and he'd already told the doctors he'd refuse any transplant on religious grounds. Rose begged me to help her get to surgery before Raymond arrived. We had maybe 30 minutes before he showed up, and Rose was sobbing that this was her only chance to live, and she was of sound mind, but the court had given Raymond control after her stroke last year, even though her brain was fine. The transplant coordinator came in saying we needed to get her prepped immediately, because the heart was only viable for another 2 hours, and there was another patient waiting if Rose couldn't receive it. Even though I knew I could lose my job, I wasn't going to let my favorite patient die when she wanted to live. I helped the nurses get her into a surgical gown while she kept checking her phone, because Raymond had been texting, asking why the hospital called him. She typed back that it was just routine tests, buying us time. The anesthesiologist came in to start her IV, and Rose begged him to hurry, but he said they needed Raymond's signature on the consent forms. Rose started crying harder, saying she wanted this surgery, she was fully competent, but the anesthesiologist said his hands were tied without power of attorney approval. I ran to the nurse's station and found Rose's doctor, explaining the situation, and she said legally they couldn't operate without Raymond's consent, but she'd try to stall him if he arrived. 20 minutes until Raymond got here and the surgical team was ready, but couldn't proceed. Rose was getting her IV placed and kept saying, "Please, I want to live." The charge nurse had an idea and moved Rose to a different room, hoping Raymond would go to her old room first and buy us time. We'd just gotten her settled when we heard Raymond's voice in the hallway, demanding to know where his mother was. The charge nurse intercepted him and said Rose was getting some tests done, and led him to the empty old room. We could hear him getting angry about the empty bed. The transplant surgeon arrived saying we had 90 minutes before the heart wouldn't be viable, and asked where we were with consent. Rose begged her to just do it anyway, but the surgeon said she'd lose her license. We heard Raymond yelling at the nurse's station that he knew something was happening and if they were hiding his mother, he'd sue everyone. The charge nurse kept trying to calm him down, but he was demanding to see Rose immediately. I stepped into the hallway to try to distract him, saying I'd just seen Rose and she was getting an x-ray. Totally routine. Raymond recognized me from previous visits and grabbed my arm, demanding I take him to her right now. I said the x-ray department was backed up and it would be at least an hour, but he didn't believe me. He started checking every room while I followed, trying to slow him down with questions about his day, but he was getting more aggressive with each empty room. He grabbed a nurse and demanded Rose's room number, but she said she didn't know. He accused us all of conspiring against him and pulled out his phone to call his lawyer. Meanwhile, the heart was sitting in a cooler, losing viability by the minute. The transplant coordinator told me we had 60 minutes before they'd have to give the heart to the other patient. I went back to Rose's new room where she was fully prepped for surgery, but couldn't go anywhere. Raymond's voice was getting closer as he worked his way down the hall, now threatening to call the police if someone didn't produce his mother immediately. The surgeon came back and said the other patient was being prepped now because we were running out of time. Rose begged me to forge Raymond's signature, but the surgeon said they'd verify it with him anyway. Suddenly, Raymond appeared in the doorway and saw Rose in the surgical gown with all the IV lines, and his face went dark red. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted. Rose tried to explain about the heart, but Raymond cut her off, saying, "We've discussed this. No transplant. God's will is God's will." He started pulling at her IV lines, and the nurses had to physically stop him. Rose was sobbing that she wanted to live, but Raymond said accepting an organ was against their beliefs. I told him Rose wanted this, but he turned on me and said I had no right to interfere in family matters. The transplant coordinator said we had 45 minutes before the heart went to someone else, and Raymond said, "Good. Give it to them." Rose screamed that she was of sound mind and wanted the surgery, but Raymond pulled out his power of attorney papers, waving them at everyone. The surgeon said without his consent they couldn't proceed and started to leave. Rose grabbed her arm, begging her not to go, and Raymond tried to pull his mother's hand away, getting physically aggressive. Security arrived, but Raymond showed them his legal papers, and they said he had the right to make medical decisions. 30 minutes left, and the heart was dying in its cooler while Rose was dying in her bed, and Raymond stood there with his arms crossed, saying this was meant to be. I stood there completely frozen, while Raymond kept his arms crossed over his chest. Rose was crying harder now, and the security guards blocked the doorway, so nobody could wheel her to surgery. The transplant coordinator grabbed her phone and started making one more call to the legal department. She kept asking if there was any way around the power of attorney, but I could hear the person on the other end saying no. 25 minutes left on that heart, and it was just sitting there in its special cooler, getting less viable every second. The coordinator hung up and shook her head at all of us before walking out to call the other patient who would get the heart instead. My whole body felt heavy, like I'd failed the one patient who trusted me most. Rose reached out and grabbed my hand really tight while tears ran down her face. She whispered that she knew I'd tried everything, and it wasn't my fault. Her eyes had this look like she wasn't giving up even though this specific heart was gone. The surgeon left without saying anything, and the anesthesiologist started removing the IV equipment while Raymond watched with this satisfied expression. The other nurses filed out one by one until it was just me and Rose and Raymond in that room. I helped Rose sit up and started getting her out of the surgical gown, while Raymond went on about how this was God's plan. He kept saying stuff about accepting what was meant to happen, and how organ donation went against their beliefs. Rose didn't say a single word back to him, and just stared at the wall with her jaw clenched so tight I thought she might crack a tooth. Raymond finally left after another 10 minutes of lecturing, and I finished helping Rose get back into her regular hospital gown. She asked me to stay with her for a few more minutes, so I sat in the chair next to her bed and held her hand. Neither of us talked about what just happened because there wasn't anything left to say. That evening after my shift, I sat at the computer in the nurse's station typing up everything that happened. My hands were shaking while I documented how Raymond had grabbed at Rose's IV lines and how the nurses had to physically stop him. I wrote down every single time Rose said she wanted the transplant, and that she was of sound mind. I included the part where Raymond threatened to sue everyone, and how he got aggressive with staff members. The whole report took me an hour to write because I wanted to make sure I got every detail right. I knew this could come back on me, but I needed there to be a record of what really happened in that room. The charge nurse found me at the computer and pulled me into the break room. She said we all needed to file formal incident reports about Raymond's behavior today. She warned me that Raymond would probably file his own complaint saying we tried to go around his legal authority. But she said it was important we got our version documented first, before he could spin the story his way. I went back and filed my incident report with even more details about the physical aggression and threats. The next morning I got to work, and my supervisor was already waiting for me at the nurse's station. She said Raymond had filed a formal complaint saying the nursing staff conspired to violate his rights as Rose's medical proxy. She asked me to come to her office and explain everything that happened from my perspective. I told her the whole story, and she seemed to understand why we'd tried to help Rose, but said there would have to be an investigation. She said I wasn't suspended or anything, but they had to follow protocol when someone filed this kind of complaint. Later that morning, Neil McCarthy from the hospital's legal department came to meet with our whole team. He explained that Raymond did have broad authority as power of attorney, but there might be ways to challenge it. He said if we could prove Rose had mental capacity and that Raymond was acting against her stated wishes, we might have a case. He told us to document everything going forward and suggested we request an ethics consultation about the situation. He also mentioned that the physical aggression Raymond showed could work in our favor if we needed to limit his access to Rose. That afternoon, the social worker came to the unit and said she was initiating an adult protective services report. She said Raymond's behavior raised concerns about medical coercion and possible elder abuse. She explained that this would trigger an automatic investigation into whether Raymond was really acting in Rose's best interests. The investigation would look at whether he was imposing his own religious beliefs instead of respecting what his mother wanted. She interviewed several of us who witnessed what happened and took copies of all our incident reports. The social worker said the investigation could take several weeks, but it was an important step in protecting Rose. 2 days later, I got an email saying the ethics committee had scheduled an emergency meeting to review Rose's case. Geneva Browning, who chaired the committee, wanted me to come provide testimony about Rose's mental state. She specifically wanted to know about all the times Rose had expressed her wishes for treatment. The meeting was set for the next day, and I spent that evening preparing what I would say. I wrote down every conversation I'd had with Rose about wanting the transplant over the past few months. I included dates and times when I could remember them, and noted who else was present for these conversations. I wanted to make sure the committee understood that Rose had been consistent about wanting to live and wanting any treatment that could help her. The meeting would include doctors and nurses and social workers and even a community member. Geneva said they would review all the documentation and testimony to make a recommendation about how to proceed with Rose's care. The security officers finished writing up their report about Raymond grabbing nurses and pulling at IV lines while I sat in the hallway checking my phone every few minutes. Neil McCarthy found me there and showed me the completed incident report, pointing to the parts about physical aggression and saying this gave us solid grounds to request a no-contact order. He explained that while we couldn't remove Raymond's power of attorney yet, we could at least limit when he could visit and require security presence during those times. I went back to check on Rose and found her staring at the ceiling with tears running down her face, her monitors showing her heart rate way too high for someone who just lost their chance at a transplant. Over the next few days, her condition got worse fast, her breathing getting harder even with the oxygen turned up high, and the doctors started her on 3 different medications just to keep her heart pumping. She was too weak to sit up anymore, but her mind stayed sharp, and every single nurse or doctor who came in heard the same thing from her about wanting to be listed for another heart. On the 3rd day, Raymond showed up with a man in a black suit carrying a Bible who he introduced as Pastor Williams from their church. They stood over Rose's bed while the pastor read verses about accepting God's plan and trusting in divine healing instead of medical intervention. Rose kept her eyes closed through the whole thing, nodding politely when they asked if she understood. But the second they left, she grabbed my hand and told me she believed God sent that first heart to save her, and Raymond was the one going against God's will by blocking it. That afternoon, I called my mentor from nursing school who worked at a hospital downtown and asked if we could meet for coffee. She listened to the whole story and pulled out a notebook, drawing diagrams about the legal boundaries we had to work within, while still advocating for our patients. She reminded me that documentation was our most powerful tool, that every single thing Rose said about wanting treatment needed to be written down with dates and times and witnesses. 2 days later, a woman named Heidi Cordova from Adult Protective Services showed up asking for Rose, and the charge nurse made sure Raymond wasn't around before bringing her to the room. Heidi spent 2 full hours sitting next to Rose's bed with a clipboard, asking detailed questions about her medical condition, what treatments she understood were available, and what she wanted for her care. Rose answered every question clearly, even though she had to pause to catch her breath between sentences, explaining her heart condition, the transplant process, and exactly why she wanted the surgery. Heidi wrote everything down and had Rose initial each page to confirm her statements. The next morning, Andre Mercer arrived with a briefcase full of assessment tools, introducing himself as the psychiatrist doing the formal capacity evaluation. He tested Rose's memory by having her repeat number sequences and recall details from earlier in the conversation. He asked her to explain the risks of transplant surgery and what would happen if she didn't get a new heart. He had her do simple math problems and asked about current events to test her awareness. Rose passed every single test, even doing better on some memory tasks than I probably would have. Andre spent extra time asking her about the transplant decision, making her explain the pros and cons, the recovery process, and what she understood about the medications she'd need to take forever after surgery. She answered everything perfectly, and he wrote in his report that she showed complete understanding of her medical situation and the consequences of her choices. That afternoon, Raymond somehow found out about all the evaluations happening and stormed into the unit demanding to know why strangers were questioning his mother without his permission. He pulled out his phone and started making calls to different hospitals, telling whoever answered that he needed to transfer his mother immediately to a facility that would respect his authority as power of attorney. The charge nurse overheard him giving Rose's medical information over the phone and immediately called our legal department. The medical team held an emergency meeting and decided to block any transfer, with 3 different doctors signing statements that Rose was too unstable to be moved and that transport could kill her. Raymond tried to arrange for a private ambulance anyway, but when they arrived and saw Rose's condition and the paperwork from our doctors, they refused to take her. The hospital's legal team worked through the night preparing paperwork for a temporary restraining order to stop Raymond from interfering with Rose's medical care. They filed it the next morning, and the judge agreed to an emergency hearing for the following week, granting a temporary order in the meantime that prevented Raymond from making any major medical decisions without court approval. During the ethics committee meeting that Geneva Browning ran, 6 different doctors and nurses stood up to testify about Rose's consistent desire for a transplant going back months before this incident. They brought charts and notes showing every time she'd asked about getting listed, every time she'd said she wanted to live, every conversation about her hopes for life after transplant. Geneva led the committee through hours of testimony and documentation before they reached a unanimous consensus that Rose's autonomy should be respected and the hospital should support her right to make her own medical decisions. The next day, HR called me into their office and explained that Raymond had filed a formal complaint alleging I'd conspired to violate his legal rights. They said they had to follow protocol and investigate, which meant putting me on paid administrative leave for 3 days while they reviewed everything. It hurt knowing I couldn't be there for Rose during this time, but I understood they had to protect the hospital from lawsuits, and at least I wasn't getting fired. The first day of my leave, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started typing everything I could remember about that day. My union rep came over with coffee and helped me organize my thoughts into clear points about patient safety. She showed me how to frame Rose's repeated statements about wanting the transplant as part of my nursing duty to advocate. We worked for 6 hours straight, going through every detail and making sure I documented Raymond's physical aggression with the IV lines. I included dates and times of every conversation where Rose had told me she wanted to live and get a new heart. The union rep reviewed each paragraph and helped me focus on professional standards rather than emotional reactions. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Andre Mercer was finishing his full capacity evaluation report on Rose. He'd spent 3 hours testing her memory, reasoning, and understanding of medical consequences during his assessment. His report stated in clear medical terms that Rose was completely competent to make her own healthcare decisions. The psychiatrist noted that she understood the risks of transplant surgery and the consequences of refusing treatment. He wrote that her desire for the transplant was consistent, rational, and based on clear understanding of her condition. This report became the most important document in the whole legal fight, because it proved Rose knew exactly what she wanted. The social worker made copies and sent them to the court, the ethics committee, and the hospital's legal team. Raymond must have gotten wind of all the legal activity, because 2 days later, a local news crew showed up at the hospital. He'd called them claiming the hospital was discriminating against his religious beliefs and forcing procedures on his mother. The reporter interviewed him outside the main entrance while he waved his power of attorney papers around. But when the news team went inside to get the hospital's side, they learned that Rose herself desperately wanted the transplant. The story aired that night, but it didn't help Raymond's case at all since they included Rose's own words about wanting to live. The next morning, the social worker arranged for Rose to make a video statement with a court-appointed witness present. They set up a tablet in her room and Rose looked straight at the camera, speaking slowly but clearly. She said she wanted the heart transplant and that her son was going against her wishes for his own religious reasons. Her voice was weak from her failing heart, but every word came through perfectly on the recording. She explained that she respected Raymond's beliefs, but they weren't her beliefs, and she had the right to choose life. The witness, a retired judge who volunteered for these situations, signed an affidavit that Rose was alert and speaking freely. That same afternoon, the social worker took all the documentation to the courthouse and filed an emergency petition. She argued that Raymond wasn't acting in Rose's best interests, and the court needed to limit his power of attorney. The filing included Andre's capacity evaluation, the video statement, and testimony from 6 different medical professionals. The court clerk scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week, but that felt like forever when Rose was getting weaker every day. The transplant team had to officially pause Rose's listing status because of the legal uncertainty, which meant she couldn't get another heart even if one became available. But the cardiac surgeon had an idea and suggested they look into getting Rose an LVAD, which is basically a mechanical pump that helps the heart work. This device didn't need a donor organ, so it might keep her alive long enough to sort out the legal mess and get her back on the transplant list. The team started running tests to see if Rose was a candidate for the LVAD surgery while we waited for the court hearing. Geneva Browning called a meeting with all the medical staff involved in Rose's care to go over the ethics committee's recommendations. She stood at the front of the conference room and explained that we had to respect Rose's autonomy while being careful not to do anything that looked coercive. She reminded everyone that Raymond still had legal authority until the court said otherwise, so we had to document everything carefully. The nurses asked questions about what they could and couldn't do, and Geneva gave specific examples of how to support Rose without overstepping legal boundaries. Neil McCarthy from legal spent the whole day working on a compromise motion that might get Rose the help she needed faster. He filed for an interim order that would let Rose consent to her own non-donor medical procedures, while the bigger power of attorney fight continued. This meant she could agree to the LVAD surgery herself without needing a transplant donor or Raymond's permission. It was a smart move that might save her life while the lawyers argued about the rest. When the cardiac team explained the LVAD option to Rose, her eyes lit up with hope for the first time in days. She understood it wasn't a cure, but it could buy her months or even years to fight for her right to get a transplant. The surgeon explained all the risks, and Rose nodded at each one, saying she'd rather take any chance than give up. Her determination was incredible considering how weak her body had become from her failing heart. She signed the consent forms herself since the LVAD fell under the interim order Neil had filed. 3 days later, the judge reviewed the emergency motion and granted the limited order, which meant Raymond couldn't interfere with the LVAD decision. The ruling specifically stated that Rose could consent to mechanical assist devices and other non-transplant cardiac interventions. When the social worker brought the news to Rose's room, she started crying with relief and grabbed my hand so tight it hurt. Raymond showed up an hour later, furious about the court order, but security reminded him he couldn't interfere with the LVAD preparation. The next morning, the surgical team scheduled Rose's LVAD surgery for the following day, and my supervisor called to say I could come back to help with pre-op prep, even though I wasn't officially her nurse anymore. I rushed to the hospital and found Rose getting her blood work done, while the nurses explained how the mechanical pump would work once it was inside her chest. She grabbed my hand when she saw me and squeezed it hard, whispering thank you over and over while tears ran down her face. The anesthesiologist came in to go over the risks, and Rose nodded at everything, signing form after form without hesitation. We got her showered with the special soap and helped her into the surgical gown, and she kept touching the spot on her chest where the device would go. The next morning, I arrived early to find Raymond already in the hallway arguing with security about his right to see his mother before surgery. He pushed past one guard and made it to Rose's room where she was getting her IV started, shouting that this was against God's will and he wouldn't let them mutilate her body with a machine. Security grabbed his arms and pulled him back while he yelled about suing everyone, but they had the court order ready and escorted him out of the building. Rose's hands were shaking as the transport team arrived to take her to the OR, and I walked alongside her gurney holding her hand until we reached the red line where only surgical staff could go. The surgery took 6 hours, and we all waited in the family lounge. Even some nurses who weren't working that day came to wait for news. The surgeon finally came out saying it had been touch and go when Rose's blood pressure dropped dangerously low, but they got the LVAD working and she was stable in the ICU. I went to see her that evening and she was hooked up to so many machines I could barely see her face, but the steady hum of the LVAD pump meant her heart was getting the help it needed. 3 days later, I found out through another nurse that the heart Rose lost had gone to a 32-year-old father in Ohio who had 3 little kids. And while I was glad someone lived, it burned me up that Rose never got to make that choice herself. The administrative hearing about my conduct happened 2 weeks later in a conference room with HR, my supervisor, and a union rep, and they went through every detail of that night with the transplant. After 3 hours of questions, they said I'd get a written warning in my file for not maintaining professional boundaries, but no suspension or termination. My supervisor pulled me aside afterwards and said she was proud of how hard I'd fought for Rose, even if the methods weren't perfect. A month later, the hospital scheduled a mediation session where Raymond had to sit across from Rose with a professional mediator who helped them work out boundaries for his visits. Raymond kept saying he was following his beliefs, but the mediator made him agree to specific rules about not interfering with medical decisions the court had approved. They wrote up a whole document about when he could visit and what topics were off limits, and Raymond signed it even though his jaw was clenched the whole time. 6 weeks of legal battles later, the judge finally ruled that Rose could consent to her own transplant if one became available, and Raymond's power of attorney was limited to just financial and housing decisions. Rose cried when they told her the news, and she immediately told the transplant team to put her back on the list as soon as she was strong enough. The cardiac rehab started slowly, with Rose learning to manage the LVAD equipment, checking the batteries, and keeping the driveline exit site clean. The physical therapist worked with her every day, first just sitting up in bed, then standing, then taking a few steps with a walker while pulling the LVAD controller in a special bag. Her determination amazed everyone as she pushed herself harder each session, even when she was exhausted and her incisions still hurt. Raymond started coming for supervised visits where a social worker sat in the room, and at first he just stood by the door with his arms crossed, not saying anything. After a few visits, he started talking about neutral things like the weather or what his kids were doing in the school, and Rose would nod and share a memory about when Raymond was young. They even laughed once about the time he got his head stuck in the porch railing when he was 6, and for a minute it felt like a normal mother and son instead of all this legal mess. 2 months after everything started, I got transferred to a different cardiac unit to avoid any appearance of conflict with Rose's ongoing care. I'd see her sometimes in the hallway during her walks with the physical therapy team, the LVAD bag hanging from her shoulder as she slowly made her way down the corridor. We'd share a quick smile and she'd give me a little wave, both of us knowing we couldn't really talk, but understanding everything that didn't need to be said. The ethics committee sent out an email 3 weeks later announcing new hospital policies for rapid capacity assessment when surrogates refused time-sensitive treatments. Geneva Browning stopped me in the hallway to say Rose's case had changed everything, and now other patients wouldn't face the same nightmare. The new protocol meant doctors could get a psychiatric evaluation within 2 hours if a surrogate's decision seemed to go against a competent patient's wishes. I printed out the policy update and kept it in my locker because it felt like something good had come from all that pain. Rose was getting stronger with her LVAD, and the cardiac team started talking about putting her back on the transplant list once she hit certain recovery milestones. 3 months after the LVAD surgery, Andre Mercer came back to do another full evaluation of Rose's mental capacity. He spent 2 hours with her, testing her memory and decision-making abilities while she answered every question perfectly. The report he filed specifically noted her consistent desire for a transplant and her complete ability to consent for herself. The transplant coordinator added Rose back to the list that same week, and Rose called me crying happy tears when she found out. Raymond had started meeting with Troy Hancock, the hospital chaplain, every Tuesday afternoon in the family conference room. I'd see them through the glass door, Raymond sitting stiff in his chair while Troy leaned forward talking quietly. The charge nurse told me Troy was helping Raymond work through his feelings about his mother's medical decisions without trying to change his religious beliefs. After a few weeks, Raymond stopped yelling at the nurses when he visited and even started saying please and thank you. I decided to go back to the school for additional certification in transplant and palliative care nursing because I wanted to be better prepared to help patients like Rose. The hospital approved my education request and even offered to cover part of the tuition if I agreed to stay on staff for 2 more years. I started taking online classes at night, learning about organ allocation systems and the legal framework around medical decision-making. 5 months after that first lost heart, I was working a night shift when the transplant coordinator rushed onto the unit looking for me. She said Rose had gotten the call about a new match, and this time there were no legal obstacles because the court order was already in place. Rose was already being prepped for surgery when I got to her room, and she grabbed my hand so tight I thought she might break it. She kept saying she couldn't believe it was really happening and asked me to call Isabel, her daughter who lived in California. Isabel answered on the second ring and started crying when I told her about the heart. She said she'd catch the first flight out and asked me to tell her mother she loved her. The surgical team took Rose down to the OR at 3 in the morning, and I watched them wheel her away with tears in my eyes. Raymond showed up an hour later and sat in the family lounge without saying much to anyone. He'd brought his Bible and sat there reading it quietly while the surgery progressed. The charge nurse kept updating him every hour about how things were going, and he'd just nod and go back to reading. 6 hours later, the surgeon came out to say everything had gone perfectly, and Rose's new heart was beating strong. Raymond closed his eyes for a moment, and I saw his lips moving in what looked like a prayer. The ICU nurses told me later that Rose woke up faster than any transplant patient they'd ever seen. She was trying to sit up within hours of surgery, even though they kept telling her to rest. Her vital signs stayed stable, and she didn't show any signs of rejection in those critical first days. Raymond came to visit following the strict guidelines the court had set up, which meant no arguments about the transplant and only positive conversation. He brought her favorite yellow roses from his garden and set them on her bedside table without saying anything about the surgery itself. They talked about his kids' soccer games and the tomatoes growing in his backyard, while the monitors beeped steadily, showing Rose's new heart working perfectly. I visited Rose every day, even though I wasn't officially her nurse anymore, and watched her get stronger with each passing hour. The physical therapy team started working with her on day 3, Just simple exercises in bed at first, then sitting up, then standing with help. Rose pushed herself hard, determined to make the most of her second chance, and the therapist had to actually slow her down sometimes. 2 weeks after the transplant, Rose was doing so well that the team started talking about discharge to cardiac rehab. She told me she felt 20 years younger and couldn't wait to do all the things she'd been too sick to do before. Her eyes sparkled when she talked about traveling to see Isabel and going to her grandkids' school plays. Isabel flew in from California on day 10 and spent every allowed visiting hour at her mother's bedside. She brought photo albums and they looked through old pictures together, laughing about family vacations and birthday parties from years ago. Isabel thanked every single person on the medical team, bringing cookies for the nurses and writing personal thank you cards to all the doctors. She pulled me aside one afternoon and said she knew I'd fought for her mother when no one else would, and she'd never forget that. The social worker arranged a family meeting before Rose's discharge, where Raymond, Isabel, and Rose all sat together for the first time in months. Raymond still didn't approve of the transplant, but he'd accepted it had been his mother's choice to make. They worked out a schedule for helping with Rose's recovery that everyone could live with. A month later, the hospital got this big letter from a patient advocacy group saying they were giving us an award for how we handled the whole mess with Rose. The administration framed it and hung it in the main lobby next to all the other awards, but this one actually meant something to me because it came from real change. They asked me to help write new policies about what to do when family members disagree with patients who want treatment, and now every new nurse has to learn about Rose's case during orientation. I was grabbing lunch in the cafeteria one Tuesday when Raymond walked past my table and actually nodded at me. We didn't say anything, but his face wasn't angry anymore, and he even sort of half smiled before sitting down across the room with his tray. The hostility that had been there for months was gone, even though we both knew we'd never really understand each other's position. Rose finished her cardiac rehab program faster than anyone expected, and the social worker found her this great assisted living place where she could have her own apartment. But nurses were right there if she needed them. She decorated it with all her photos and plants, and when I visited, she was practically glowing with how well her new heart was working. She'd walk the halls every morning and afternoon, did chair yoga 3 times a week, and joined the book club where she was already organizing author visits. 6 months after that nightmare with the first heart, I got this card in my work mailbox with a picture of Rose at her granddaughter's high school graduation. She was standing there in a bright yellow dress, beaming next to this teenage girl in cap and gown, and on the back she wrote that she wouldn't have made it without nurses who fought for their patients even when it was hard. The hospital decided to make Rose's case part of their grand rounds presentations, and they had me speak about the nursing perspective while the lawyers talked about the legal stuff, and the ethics people discussed autonomy versus surrogate decision-making. It became required education for all staff, and they started using it at other hospitals too after word got around about what happened. Raymond started visiting Rose every Wednesday afternoon, and they figured out this system where they just didn't talk about medical stuff at all. They'd play cards or look at old photo albums, or he'd bring his kids to see their grandmother, and everyone kept things light and normal. It wasn't perfect, and sometimes you could see the tension when someone mentioned doctors or hospitals, but they were making it work better than before. I stayed in cardiac care, and every time we got a complicated case with family drama or legal issues, I'd remember Rose and how important it was to document everything and advocate for what patients actually wanted. One patient's daughter tried to override her mother's DNR, and I knew exactly how to handle it because of what I'd learned. Another time a man wanted experimental treatment, but his wife said no, and we got ethics involved right away, instead of waiting for it to blow up. Rose kept sending updates every few months with pictures of her doing things she never thought she'd get to do again. She flew out to California to visit Isabel, and they went wine tasting in Napa, which she said was amazing, even though she could only have tiny sips because of her medications. She spent Christmas with Raymond's family and cooked the whole dinner herself, which exhausted her, but made her so happy she cried. The best update came a whole year after the transplant when she sent this picture of her and Raymond at a 5K walk for organ donation awareness. He was wearing the event t-shirt and everything, walking right beside her as she pushed her walker decorated with ribbons and signs thanking organ donors. She wrote that he still didn't agree with transplants for religious reasons, but he supported her choice to live her life the way she wanted, and that was enough. She'd joined a support group for transplant recipients and was mentoring new patients going through the same fears she'd faced. She'd even started writing letters to her donor's family, though she didn't know if they'd write back. The last line of her card said she was planning a cruise to Alaska next spring with Isabel, because she'd always wanted to see glaciers, and now she actually could. Working in cardiac care means seeing a lot of death and suffering, but Rose reminded me why we do this job in the first place. Every time I help prep someone for transplant surgery now, I think about that heart sitting in the cooler while we tried everything to get Rose to the OR. Every time families fight about treatment decisions, I remember Raymond's red face and his mother sobbing that she wanted to live. The hospital gave me a commendation too, but honestly the only reward that mattered was seeing Rose walk out of here with her new heart beating strong and knowing I'd done everything I could to help her get the life she wanted. Well, folks, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for hanging out with me and letting me ramble through all those little details. I always love diving into this stuff with you. Until next time, Stay curious and keep exploring. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.